morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So, I knew how you all would be feeling, knowing that I was coming back. So I decided to title my sermon based on how you were all probably feeling about things. This is good grief. And so, what we're going to be exploring, I'm happy that we talked about prayer this morning, because there's a pretty large aspect of prayer in the Old Testament that is used infrequently, if at all, in most Christian worship. And I want to talk about it. I want to talk about its importance, its role in Christian communities, in personal prayer and worship time, as well as in communal settings, because I think it's really important, and I think it gets to the heart of a lot of our experience in this world, in this fallen world, and just in the ups and downs of daily life. So this sermon kind of carries on and piggybacks off of what Daishan has been talking about recently, excluding last week, but the weeks before, where, especially the sermon, fortunately they're all online, so I was able to access them. The sermon, there are no words. Well, in a lot of ways, that's exactly true. There are no words to describe or to really get at the root of the pain and the suffering that we may experience sometimes and that our communities experience. But on another sense, and this is, hearkening to my theological roots, there's a yes and no there, right? There are no words, but there also are words in different senses of the terms. And so I want to explore some areas where there are words, and there's actually an abundance of literature that we can draw upon to use in our communal worship and our personal prayer time. Now, I'd like to make the case that Christians don't lament enough. And this might sound strange, but if you think about it, there's an entire book in the Old Testament called Lamentations, and a large portion of the Psalter is all Psalms of lament. And yet we seem to not do it. And it makes sense. There's a lot of reason for Christians to be worshiping and excited. And, there's the resurrection and the ascension. This is awesome, right? And I don't mean to diminish those things at all. But when we neglect lament in the role of our communal worship, we really lose a really central aspect about what it means to be human, because we go through suffering. Our communities go through suffering. Our country goes through suffering. The world is suffering. And so when we fail to give voice to that, we really neglect an essential aspect of life in community and life in community in relation to God. Now, let me clarify, because Africa is probably thinking, my husband does not need any more excuses or justifications for complaining. Especially about his interns. And he does have good reason to complain about his interns. So I won't blame him for that. But I'd agree, Africa. I think that we don't need to give Daishan more justification for his complaints. Even if they may not be an exaggeration when he's talking about his interns. But that brings us to an important discussion, which is the difference between complaint and lament, which are two very different things. And I'd like to clarify that before we move on to the scripture passage. So, what is lament? And this is a drawing that someone did of me after I left the congregation in January. When I went back to school, I ran into a friend who was an artist, and they decided to draw exactly what I looked like. No, this is a picture. This is quote-unquote sackcloth and ashes, which was a typical institution within Jewish prayer and worship during seasons of lament or mourning or suffering. They would literally put on a sackcloth and cover themselves in ashes, and they would sing psalms of lament. So, what do we think of when we think of lament? We can get some volunteers here. Any ideas about what lament might be? And if we don't have volunteers, that's okay, because I'm going to end up answering it anyway from nothing. All right. So I'm going to work off of some definitions of lament that one of my professors in seminary has used in one of her books, which is called Prayer Without Ceasing, which I recommend for everyone. It's an awesome book about prayer. So she writes that lament is faith's alternative to despair. It is petitionary prayer springing from unrelieved suffering. And it's a bending of anguish and anger into supplication to God. So, the difference between complaining and lament is that when we complain, we're usually talking about trivial things for the most part, right? Like Daishan didn't do the dishes, or Daishan didn't, close the windows when it started raining, things like that. But lament is when we take those real deep heart cries, the suffering and the pain in the depths of our soul, and turn it to God. Because when we don't turn it to God, then we're just in despair, right? So we need to be sure that when we have that anguish of the soul, which in many ways and in many different times, I think all of us can relate to, that we take that and we turn it to God, and we bring it to God in prayer and worship. And then she also says it's the hope that refuses to give up hope, which is one of my favorite definitions that she uses. So when we're talking about prayer, and when we're talking about lament, one of the main ways that lament has been used historically is in song and poetry. And this is across human societies, and this is going to obviously connect to our use of the Psalms. But the role of poetry and song and dance is really important because these are things for which there's no words. I mean, these are emotions and issues that are beyond human explication on a merely rational level, you know? So we turn to poetry, we turn to song, we turn to music to really get at those feelings that we can't articulate well just with words. So I'm going to give some examples. This is a little quiz, and it does require audience participation. But I'm going to put up 3 pictures, and I want to see if you can tell me the very famous song that attempts to discuss the picture in question. Now, the first one's going to be pretty hard, but those of you who know how much I like Irish history may be able to get it. And then the other 2, I think, are a little bit easier. So does anyone know what this picture is of? And then we'll talk about the song you might refer to. The Depression, that's a good guess. Not quite. No, not really. Good guess, though. No, but that's a great guess. That's all right. So this is what's known as the Bogside Massacre, which occurred on January 30th, 1972, where a group of British soldiers, so in Northern Ireland there was basically ghettoization of the Catholics and nationalists in the north, and the north was still part of the British, of Great Britain. And so inspired by Martin Luther King and a lot of the civil rights movements going on in the United States, a lot of Irish nationalists and unionists who supported the Catholic cause in the north decided to march and do civil rights protests. And this is a picture of the aftermath when the crowds were dispersed and basically running away because the British Army fired into just open fire. They ended up killing 14 people and injuring 27. And this became known as the largest recruiting day for the IRA in Irish history because the whole British Army just lit up an entire crowd of unarmed civilians. There was an initial report which said that the Catholics fired first and that the protesters fired. And then about 10 years ago, actually, they did a thorough investigation. They found that a lot of the soldiers had basically lied about it. And anyway, we could go into all the history behind that for days. But anyone can guess the song that talks about this? What's that? Good guess. Close. It's a U2 song. Bloody Sunday, right? Anyone heard that song? Very famous U2 song. How long shall we sing this song, right? Is the long sectarian violence, a reference to the long, continuous sectarian violence in Ireland. Now, how about this next picture? Anyone can guess? Buffalo Soldiers, nice. And who sings it? Bob Marley, right? Yes, exactly. Right. So this is the Buffalo Soldiers. This is the 9th, 10th, 23rd, and 25th Cavalry Regiments of all African Americans conscripted in 1866. And this has been heavily criticized because a lot of people see it as the government sending one minority group to kill another, which was the Native Americans on the frontier. But actually the oldest Buffalo Soldier passed away in the last decade. The last surviving Buffalo Soldier, not of the original 1866, obviously. Yes?
They are actually having the sesquicentennial.
No way.
Yes.
Wow.
Actually,
yeah, that's great.
This week, to be exact.
Wow, that's awesome. I didn't even know that. That's so timely. Great. Yeah, so that's Bob Marley, Buffalo Soldier, giving voice to that experience and the suffering that that community went through. Now this one's a little tougher. It's obviously a flood, and it's not Katrina. What's that?
Hurricane Betsy.
Nope. So this is 1920s. It's tough. It's tough. Yeah, it's kind of tougher. But this is 1927, the Great Mississippi Flood, which we don't really talk about a lot, but it's one of the major motivations for, historically, for black migration to the north. That is kind of what kicked off what became a pattern throughout the 30s and 40s. But the Mississippi River flooded and displaced hundreds of thousands of people all across the river. And the famous song is a Led Zeppelin song, and it does refer to the levees and them not working. Right, so When the Levee Breaks by Led Zeppelin is a famous song that refers to this event and which has been kind of revived in the post-Katrina stage. What's that? Yeah, so When the Levee Breaks is the song that refers to this. Now, the difference between these songs and what we're talking about here in Lament is that these songs express the suffering, but they're not necessarily turning it toward God. And they're not necessarily doing it in prayer, which is fine for the purposes that they have. And actually, you could argue that U2 is doing that, because they do that a lot. But poetry and song have great power to bring us to moments of real raw emotion and to really work through those experiences that we have and the trials and traumas that we face in our life. So an interesting aspect, before I move on to the psalm itself, is that this is actually a central aspect of Jewish prayer and worship. Until the 1800s, it was forbidden in Judaism to do prayer and worship in a major key because it was seen as being too joyful. And it wasn't, we're not happy, we're not excited about things. We are a suffering people and we are a people in exile. And so all Jewish music was in minor keys up until that point in time. And actually it's still a big point of controversy that some groups have made it into major keys. And then also in Judaism, the Wailing Wall. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Wailing Wall, but it is a surviving wall of the collapsed and destroyed temple in Jerusalem. The Roman army destroyed it in 70 AD. And it's a major site of Jewish pilgrimage where people go, and it's called the Wailing Wall because people go and wail, and they moan and they cry, and it's a very, very sacred space for the Jews, as it should be. And it's a major pilgrimage site. So this theme of lament is super important for the Jewish community. And for Christians, we kind of just gloss over it. And there's different reasons for that. Theologically, there's some reasons for that. But I think it's important that we kind of revive it and we bring it back to a more central space while not ignoring the resurrection and the ascension and the incarnation, atonement, and all that wonderful stuff. We shouldn't lose sight of these other more raw aspects of human experience and suffering. So, now we're going to get into the psalm. We're going to look at Psalm 13. And Psalm 13 is nice because it's short. It's 6 verses. So any of you who are looking for a devotional psalm to lament with, it's a great psalm and it won't take you forever. So this psalm starts off, she kind of just goes straight in for the kill, the psalmist, right at the beginning. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? So one of the interesting things that I want to point out here is that the part about her enemy, or about the specific historical circumstances that seem to be inspiring the psalm, are not the center point, and they're not the starting point for her. Her center point is her sense of abandonment from God. She is in serious suffering, and she feels like God has totally turned his back and neglected her. And she calls him out on it. She doesn't mince her words. She doesn't pretend everything's okay when it's not. She is very raw and very straight up about exactly how she's feeling. You have forgotten me, God. You have left me, and I am suffering as a result. And so the implicit connection here is that if God has abandoned her, or if she's feeling abandoned by God, then it's God's responsibility to fix the situation. It's not her responsibility. It's not the people around her's responsibility. She calls God out and says, hey, you, do your job, man. And so obviously the enemy part is an aspect of it, but it's not the deeper aspect, right? So it's not a merely material complaint, right? It's not a merely you didn't do the dishes. It's a, you didn't do the dishes, but I feel like God has abandoned me because of this. Which might be how Africa feels on a regular basis. I'm sorry, I've been away for a while, so I just have to get all of my rising of Daishan out when I can.
Don't worry, I'll remember.
Alright, you remember, you keep this in mind.
I was actually going to say, because he does most of the cooking, so I'm not complaining about it.
There you go, exactly. Right. So the psalmist here, she takes note of the problems in her normal life, but goes beyond these problems to locate them in the context of her relationship with God, which in this case is apparently irrelevant, or a lack of relationship, I should say. So this is the first two verses here, and now we're going to go on to verses 3 and 4. Verse 3 goes, "Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. And my enemy will say, I have prevailed. My foes will rejoice because I am shaken." So again, the enemy does come into play here, but it's really God turning to her, which is the center point of this psalm. And this is actually the third verse. This is the center of the psalm, which we'll get to a little bit more later. But here we see that she doesn't just make it seem like everything's going to be okay if God doesn't, show up and do something. She says, "Fix this, God, or I'm going to die." I mean, there's no other options here. You need to act, or I will certainly perish. And it's consider and answer me. So she doesn't necessarily get right to fix this situation around me. She's saying, respond to me personally. Like, I need you to come to me and to fix what's going on with me. Ideally, fix what's going on with my enemies, I mean, that's certainly not irrelevant. But it's not the primary concern for her. The primary concern is that she no longer be or feel abandoned by God. Now, what strikes me about this passage is that I rarely, if ever, approach God in this kind of demanding intimacy, which is really more akin to a child demanding of their parents than an adult in pious prayer, or at least so I tend to think. But then again, maybe my understanding of what pious prayer looks like is mistaken. Maybe I need to be more like a child to enter the kingdom of heaven. The demands here presume that God should and does care about my anguish and pain. A God who is willing to hear my cry and my demands, and a God who desires to console and relieve me of this suffering. A God who knows me, who is by nature a comforter. And these demands presume intimacy and mutual knowing, an intimacy that a person knows when they live in utter dependence upon the other, much like a child's relation to a parent. For children who are not old enough to articulate their needs, tears and screams of anguish will suffice. As Nadia and Clyde, who unfortunately aren't here today, are surely aware, these are more than enough to get the attention of their parental caregivers. Now, as we move and look at especially at verse 4 for a moment, we notice that the pain and death is related to her environment, to a situation that's ongoing. And so this isn't glossed over, and we don't merely have hope in a immaterial post-death life. We do have hope for this life and hope for healing and redemption in this life, but that's not the primary focus. So the psalmist's suffering is impacted by what's going on, by the persecution or perhaps violence that's threatening her. And this offers an important caveat to what we're talking about here, because we don't place our hope in this life alone. We do place it in a life after this life, in a life beyond, or transcending this life, if you will. But we do also pay attention to the suffering in this world, and we are called to act in what's going on in this world and in the lives of others to alleviate suffering and to be the salt of the earth, right? So we have to hold these two together, where we don't collapse either side of the equation. We don't ignore the material, thinking about what's going to happen after we perish, but we also need to keep in mind that there is a larger reality at play here, and that needs to be our focal point of where we're headed. So, the final two verses are a little shocking. She says, "But I trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me." Now, we have no information here of any real change in her external circumstances, right? She doesn't say, "My enemies are gone. Thanks, God. I appreciate that. You did me a big one there." Nothing. We get nothing. "I trust in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation." The other thing about this is that it's a future tense. My heart shall rejoice. My heart is going to rejoice in your salvation. Has it come? I don't know. We don't necessarily know, and we're not necessarily given that information that she is experiencing that salvation right now and in this moment. And she says, "I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. So again, the tenses get mixed up here where she says, I will sing to the Lord, future tense, because he has dealt. So that's past tense, right? And we don't know how he's dealt bountifully with her. Perhaps he answered her and he responded to her and she felt consoled enough in that, and maybe the situation with her enemies didn't change at all. But she felt like she was heard of God and responded to by God. Or perhaps there was an actual change in the external circumstances, which she simply does not describe. In the psalmists, the writers are pretty famous for this, where they tried to they're making poetry for the community. So they're not necessarily going to go into all the specifics of what's going on, because they want it to be used and useful for people in all sorts of situations. Now, an interesting thing about this passage, and I just took a year of Hebrew, so I noticed this, where the word salvation in Hebrew is the word Yeshua, which, does anyone know what the word Yeshua would mean to a Jew in the Old Testament? Yep, so Messiah is overtones of Messiah, but it's also Joshua. The name Joshua is Yeshua. And so my heart shall rejoice in your salvation. And you're saying Yeshua there, what is Joshua to the Jewish people? He's the one who led them into the promised land, right? He led them into their land flowing with milk and honey, right? And he brought them there, and according to the book of Joshua, destroyed all the people living there. Yeah. So it gets dark. It gets a little dark before it gets better. But then the rest of the Old Testament shows basically the opposite, where there's a relative stability of peace between all these Canaanite tribes, and the Jews are one of them. Before David, the book of Judges shows that all the people that the book of Joshua just said were annihilated are actually alive and well and around us. So interesting historical biblical studies there. But Joshua is the one who leads them. He takes over, he takes Moses' mantle and leads the people into the promised land. Now, we got a little bit ahead of ourselves. What else is Yeshua?
Jesus.
Jesus, right? Jesus' name, so we get the name Jesus from the Greek translation of the word, but his name is actually Yeshua in the Aramaic, which is then translated to Greek, and then to English. But Jesus and Joshua have the same name, at least originally. And so when she says that I have trusted in your salvation, we as Christians can look at that in two different ways. I mean, we can look at it in a lot of ways, but two specific ways are God does act in our material circumstances to bring change and transformation, and we can participate in that work that he's doing. But he also is above and beyond what is merely material, right? He works above and beyond our situation, the context that we're suffering in, to bring healing and redemption at the deepest level of our human being. And now, I'd like to show something that I've hidden from you intentionally until now. I'm sure Mako probably noticed it because he's obsessed with these things. But this passage is a chiasm. A chiasm is a typical form of ancient Near Eastern literature where we use the first point and correspond it to the last point. And there's usually key phrases or words that are used in each to show that they're corresponding. So what we see here, and this is actually throughout the Old Testament, this is all over the place. Just ask Mako about it. He'll give you hours and hours of material to think about. But it's actually also in J.K. Rowling's what is it? J.K. Rowling did not write The Lord of the Rings. Harry Potter, that's what it is. Sorry. I know. I'm off my game. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm nervous. My sister's here. She's obsessed with Harry Potter.
So you better get the facts today.
I know. Well, I'm nervous talking about it around here because I don't want to get corrected. So if you look here, the psalmist has Lord and Lord in the first and last, my heart in the second and the penultimate, and then my enemy in the other two. And then we have the center point, which is basically the thesis statement of this passage, which says, consider and answer me, O Lord my God, give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. So the central point here is where the psalmist assumes and acts toward God in precisely the way that Jesus urges us to do in the New Testament. as a child in radical dependence upon her heavenly Father. So she employs no false piety and no roundabout explanations. There are no, please Lord, or I would really appreciate it if you might consider possibly doing X, Y, and Z. There's no negotiating with God. Instead, she is direct and her needs are clearly articulated. Act, Lord, or I'm going to die. We, similarly, are called to approach God with this type of intimacy, this trust, and this dependence. We're called to depend on Him in all areas of our life, especially those areas where we experience suffering, pain, and hopelessness. God desires relationship and fellowship with us, but requires that we come as we are, not as we think we should be, or with all our fabrications and presentations in order. So let us take these psalms of lament into our prayer lives, as individuals experiencing intense suffering, loss, sickness, and death, as tools to help us express our anguish and direct it towards God, the one who alone can comfort us in the depths of our souls. While we ought not explain the pain away, or minimize it, we as Christians are summoned to rely upon God first and foremost to meet our needs, to turn toward Him as a child in need. We can do this together as a community, in our own prayer life, and in our worship services, and we can also do this individually, in our quiet times, in our Lectio Divina, all sorts of things. God is an amazing God who can hear and respond to our laments in ways neither our spouse, friends, needy interns, or anyone else possibly can. So, let us pray. Lord, you are the God who delivers and brings light to darkness. You are faithful and you are life. Bring us your life, Lord. Manifest your light and revive us in our brokenness and darkness. Bring your life and your healing to our community, our neighborhoods, our nation. Bring your salvation to our world, Lord. Act, Lord, or we shall all perish. Consider and answer the anguish of those suffering in Kabul, Munich, Baton Rouge, Minneapolis, Miami, Syria, Iraq, Honduras, El Salvador, and all the places of the world where there is deep suffering and violence. Hear the cries of your children, Lord, and bring them your salvation. And as we demand your action, Lord, we also thank you for acting. Thank you for acting in the many ways that we never see and that are never reported in the news. Thank you for healing us and our communities beyond reason and understanding. Thank you for bringing us here today to celebrate and share in your healing and life with one another. And most of all, thank you that you have come. Your Yeshua salvation has come. May we, by the power of your Spirit, experience that salvation in all areas of our life.